You're being controlled by your emotions. Every time you react without thinking, every time anger, guilt, or fear dominate your response, every time anxiety dictates your decisions, you are not in control. Your emotions are. And emotional control is the invisible force that separates those who lead from those who follow, those who win from those who lose, those who shape reality from those who are shaped by it. It's not about repressing your feelings. It's not about becoming a machine. It's about a mental restructuring that makes you immune to chaos, manipulation, and emotional traps. It's about staying calm when everyone else is losing their minds. It's about acting based on calculation rather than reaction. Everything else is emotional slavery pretending to be authenticity. Chapter 1. Your emotions are not you. You are being controlled right now, not by some external force, not by circumstance. You're being controlled by your emotions, and you do not even realize it, because you think you are your emotions. You think when you feel angry, you're angry. When you feel anxious, you're anxious. When you feel sad, you are sad. But that is the lie that keeps you enslaved. You are not your emotions. You are the observer of your emotions. And until you make that separation, you will remain controllable by anyone who can trigger what you feel. Here is the fundamental separation most people never make. You are not your emotions. You're the awareness that experiences emotions. When anger arises, there is anger, and there's you watching anger arise. When fear appears, there is fear, and there is you noticing fear appear. The emotion is an event happening within your awareness. It is not who you are, but you have been taught to identify with every feeling that passes through your nervous system. And that identification is destroying your ability to control yourself. That is the key. When you identify as your feelings, every emotional fluctuation controls your behavior. You feel angry, so you act angry. You feel afraid, so you avoid. You feel sad, so you withdraw. The emotion dictates the action. The feeling becomes the command. And you obey without question because you believe the feeling is you. But when you separate identity from emotion, everything changes. Feelings become data you evaluate rather than commands you obey. You have a choice. You can continue identifying with every emotion and letting feelings control your decisions. Or you can start separating yourself from emotions and treating feelings as temporary experiences that do not define who you are or determine what you do. But you cannot do both. And right now, your identification with emotion is making you weak, predictable, and easily controlled. Think about the last time you felt strong emotion, real emotion, maybe anger at someone who disrespected you, maybe fear before a high-pressure situation, maybe sadness after a loss. In that moment, did you observe the emotion or did you become the emotion? If you're like most people, you became it. You did not say there is anger arising. You said, I am angry. You did not say there is fear present. You said, I am afraid. You merged with the emotion. You identified as the feeling. And the moment you did that, the emotion controlled you completely. That is the problem. Identification eliminates choice. When you are the emotion, you have no distance from it. You have no perspective on it. You have no ability to evaluate whether acting on it serves you. You just react. The emotion arises, you identify with it, and you act from it automatically. That is not control. That is being controlled. That is emotional slavery. But there is another way. You can observe the emotion without becoming it. You can notice anger arising without identifying as angry. You can feel fear present without identifying as afraid. You can experience sadness without identifying as sad. And in that space between the emotion and your identity, choice becomes possible. Because you're not the emotion. You are the one observing the emotion. And the observer can choose how to respond. It is not about suppressing emotion. It is not about pretending you do not feel things. It is about recognizing that feelings are experiences you have, not identities you are. The emotion is temporary. The emotion is data. The emotion is information about your internal state. But the emotion is not you. And once you make that separation, the emotion loses its power to control you. Here is why emotional identification makes you controllable. People who believe they are their emotions can be manipulated by anyone who can trigger those emotions. If you identify as angry when anger arises, then anyone who can make you angry controls your behavior. If you identify as afraid when fear appears, then anyone who can scare you controls your decisions. If you identify as anxious when anxiety surfaces, then anyone who can stress you controls your actions. That is how marketers control you. They trigger fear of missing out and you buy. They trigger anxiety about status and you spend. They trigger anger about injustice and you click, share, engage. They do not need to convince you rationally. They just need to trigger the emotion. Because once the emotion is triggered and you identify with it, you act from it automatically. That is how manipulators control you. They trigger guilt and you comply. They trigger sympathy and you give. They trigger anger and you react exactly as they predicted. They study what triggers you. They push those buttons deliberately. And you dance to their tune because you cannot separate yourself from the emotions they trigger. That is how toxic people control you. They know your emotional triggers. They know what makes you angry, what makes you afraid, what makes you doubt yourself. And they use those triggers to control your behavior, to make you predictable, to make you manageable, to keep you under control. And it works because you identify with the emotions they trigger. You have a choice. You can continue being controlled by anyone who can trigger your emotions. Or you can start building the separation that makes you immune to emotional manipulation. One approach keeps you enslaved to feelings. The other approach gives you freedom from them. Here is the protocol. The observer protocol that creates separation. You train the observer, the part of you that watches emotions arise and pass without being swept away. And you train it the same way you train anything. Through practice, through repetition, through consistent application until it becomes automatic. Start with the next emotion that arises. Any emotion, anger, fear, sadness, anxiety, frustration, whatever appears. And instead of identifying with it, you observe it. You say there is anger instead of I am angry. You say there is fear instead of I am afraid. You say there is anxiety instead of I am anxious. You change the language from identification to observation. And that linguistic shift creates psychological separation. But language alone is not enough. You also notice where the emotion lives in your body. Anger might be tension in your jaw. Fear might be tightness in your chest. Anxiety might be butterflies in your stomach. You observe the physical sensations without judging them, without trying to change them, without identifying with them. You just notice, there is tension in my jaw. There is tightness in my chest. There are sensations in my stomach. And then you watch the emotion move. Because emotions are not static. They arise. They peak. They fade. They pass. But you only see that movement if you are observing instead of identifying. When you identify with the emotion, it feels permanent. It feels like this is who you are now. But when you observe the emotion, you see it is temporary. It is a wave that rises and falls. It is weather that changes. It is an experience that passes. That is the key. Emotions are temporary experiences, not permanent identities. But you only know that if you observe them long enough to watch them change. Most people never do that. Most people feel the emotion, identify with it, react from it, and never see it pass. Because they're too busy being the emotion to watch the emotion move. You have a choice right now. Continue identifying with your emotions and remaining controllable. Or start practicing the observer protocol and building separation. One approach keeps you weak. The other approach makes you powerful. Here is what happens when you build observer strength. Emotions still arise. You still feel things, but you no longer become them. You no longer identify as them. You notice them like you notice weather. There is a storm happening. Interesting. There is sunshine happening. Noted, the weather is not you. The weather is just weather. And emotions are just emotions. They happen. They pass. And you remain the observer who watches them move. And that changes everything. Because when you're the observer instead of the emotion, you have choice. Choice about how to respond. Choice about what action to take. Choice about whether the emotion should influence your behavior at all. The emotion no longer commands you. The emotion informs you. And you decide what to do with that information. Most people will never make this separation. Most people will spend their entire lives identified with every emotion that passes through their system. They will be controlled by their feelings. They will be manipulated through their emotions. They will be slaves to every fluctuation of their nervous system. And they will call that authenticity. They will say, I'm just being real with my feelings. But they're not being real. They're being controlled. But you're not most people. You understand that emotional identification is weakness. You understand that separation is power. You understand that you're not your emotions. You are the observer of your emotions. And that separation is what makes you immune to manipulation, resistant to control, and capable of choosing your responses instead of reacting automatically. Your emotional control starts here, with this separation, with the recognition that you're not your feelings. You're the awareness that experiences feelings. Make that separation. Train the observer. Practice noticing emotions without becoming them. That is not theory. That is the foundation of everything else. Without this separation, nothing else works. With this separation, everything becomes possible. You are not your emotions. You are the observer of your emotions. Remember that. Practice that. Live that. You separated identity from emotion. Now let us talk about what you do in the space between trigger and response. Chapter 2. Reaction is weakness. Response is power. You think speed is strength. You think the ability to respond instantly, to fire back immediately, to act without delay is proof of capability. But you are wrong. Speed is not strength. Speed is weakness. Because when you respond instantly, you are not responding. You are reacting. And reaction is controlled by whoever or whatever triggered you. Response is controlled by you. That is the difference. And that difference determines whether you control your life or whether your life controls you. Here is what you need to understand. There is a critical difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is automatic, emotional, and controlled by external triggers. Something happens and you immediately act. Someone provokes you and you instantly fire back. Someone criticizes you and you immediately defend. That is reacting. That is being controlled by the stimulus. That is handing power to whoever or whatever triggered you. Responding is different. Responding is deliberate, calculated, and controlled by internal standards. Something happens and you pause. You observe. You evaluate. You decide what action serves your interests. And then you act from that decision. Not from the trigger. Not from the emotion. From your choice. That is responding. That is maintaining control. That is keeping power where it belongs. With you. That is the key. The gap between stimulus and response is where your power lives. And most people never access it. Most people collapse the gap to zero. Stimulus arrives, reaction follows instantly. No gap, no pause, no choice. Just automatic response controlled by external triggers. And that automatic response is what makes them predictable, manipulable, and weak. You have a choice. You can continue reacting instantly to everything and remain controlled by triggers. Or you can start installing a gap between stimulus and response and reclaim control over your actions. But you cannot do both. And right now, your instant reactions are making you weak and predictable. Think about the last time someone provoked you. Really provoked you. Maybe they disrespected you. Maybe they challenged you. Maybe they said something designed to get a reaction. What did you do? If you're like most people, you reacted immediately. You defended. You attacked back. You justified. You explained. And in that instant reaction, you prove they control you. Because they pushed a button and you responded exactly as they knew you would. That is the problem. Immediate reactions always serve someone else's agenda. When you react instantly to provocation, criticism, or pressure, you hand control to whoever triggered you. They wanted a reaction. You gave them a reaction. They wanted you emotional. You became emotional. They wanted you defensive. You defended. They controlled your behavior by controlling the stimulus. And you let them because you reacted instead of responded. But here is what the strong do. They pause. Someone provokes them, and they do not react. Someone criticizes them, and they do not defend. Someone pressures them, and they do not comply. They pause. They observe what is happening. They recognize the manipulation attempt, and then they respond. Not from emotion, not from trigger, from strategy, from their own standards, from what actually serves their interests. That is power, not the power to react quickly. The power to not react at all until you have decided what response serves you. And that power only exists in the gap, the pause, the space between stimulus and response. That gap is where you stop being controlled by triggers and start controlling your actions. It is not about being slow. It is not about hesitating. It is about recognizing that immediate reactions are usually wrong reactions. That the first impulse is usually the impulse that serves whoever triggered you, not the response that serves you. That speed of reaction is often a trap that makes you predictable and manipulable. Here is why speed of response is often a trap. The people who want to control you know that instant reactions are emotional reactions. They know that if they can trigger you quickly enough, you will respond before you think, before you evaluate, before you recognize what is happening. And that instant emotional reaction is exactly what they want. Because emotional reactions are predictable. Emotional reactions follow patterns. And if they know your patterns, they control your responses. That is how manipulators work. They study your triggers. They learn what makes you react. And then they push those buttons deliberately to get predictable responses. The provocation that makes you defend. The criticism that makes you justify. The pressure that makes you comply. They do not need to force you. They just need to trigger you. And you react automatically because you have no gap, no pause, no control. You have a choice. Continue being predictable through instant reactions, or start becoming unpredictable through deliberate responses. One approach makes you controllable. The other approach makes you dangerous. Here is the protocol. Installing the pause that changes everything. You build the gap between stimulus and response. And you build it the same way you build any capability. Through practice, through repetition, through consistent application until it becomes automatic. Start with one breath. That is all. When something triggers you, when someone provokes you, when pressure arrives, before you do anything, you take one breath. One deliberate, conscious breath. Inhale, exhale. That is the gap. That is the pause. That is the space where you reclaim control. One breath does not sound like much, but one breath is enough. Enough to recognize you have been triggered. Enough to interrupt the automatic reaction. Enough to create the space where choice becomes possible. Because in that one breath, you shift from reacting to responding. From being controlled by the trigger to controlling your response. But one breath is just the beginning. As you practice, the gap expands. One breath becomes 5 seconds. 5 seconds becomes 10. 10 seconds becomes however long you need to evaluate the situation, decide what response serves your interests, and execute that response deliberately. The gap grows. And as the gap grows, your control grows. Your power grows. Your immunity to manipulation grows. That is the key. The pause is not delay. The pause is power. The pause is the space where you stop being controlled by external triggers and start being directed by internal standards. The pause is where reaction becomes response. The pause is where weakness becomes strength. Most people will never install this pause. Most people will continue reacting instantly to everything and wonder why they feel out of control. They will wonder why they keep falling for the same manipulations. They will wonder why they keep responding emotionally when they know they should stay calm. And they will never realize that the problem is not the triggers. The problem is the lack of pause. The problem is the collapsed gap between stimulus and response. But you're not most people. You understand that immediate reaction is weakness. You understand that deliberate response is power. You understand that the gap is where control lives. And you're willing to practice building that gap until it becomes automatic. Here's what the practice looks like. Starting tomorrow, every time you feel triggered, you pause. 1 breath minimum. No reaction until after the breath. Someone provokes you, breath first. Someone criticizes you, breath first. Someone pressures you, breath first. The trigger arrives, the breath creates the gap, and in that gap you decide how to respond. At first, this will feel unnatural. Your body will want to react immediately. Your emotions will push for instant response. Your old patterns will scream at you to fire back, to defend, to react. Ignore all of that. Take the breath. Create the gap. Let the impulse pass. And then respond from choice instead of from trigger. You have a choice right now. Continue reacting instantly and remaining controlled by whoever can trigger you. Or start installing the pause and reclaiming control over your responses. One approach keeps you weak and predictable. The other approach makes you strong and unpredictable. Here is what happens when you master the pause. You stop being controlled by triggers. Someone provokes you and you pause. You observe what they are trying to do. You recognize the manipulation attempt, and you respond strategically. Maybe you do not respond at all. Maybe you respond in a way they do not expect. Maybe you respond in a way that turns the manipulation back on them. But you do not react. You do not give them what they wanted. You maintain control, and that control changes everything. Because when people cannot trigger you, they cannot control you. When provocation does not work, manipulators lose their power. When pressure does not make you react emotionally, you become immune to the primary tool that keeps most people controllable. You become someone who cannot be manipulated through emotional triggers. And that makes you dangerous. Your emotional control depends on this gap, on this pause, on this space between stimulus and response where you reclaim power from whatever triggered you. Build the gap. Practice the pause. Install the breath protocol. That is not optional. That is the mechanism that transforms reaction into response. That is how you stop being controlled and start controlling yourself. You learn to separate identity from emotion. Now you learn to separate stimulus from response. Both separations are required. Both create the space where control becomes possible. You installed the pause. Now, let us talk about the verbal leak that gives away power. Chapter 3. Stop explaining yourself to everyone. You talk too much. Not in general. Not in conversation. You explain too much. You justify too much. You defend your decisions to people who have no authority over your life. And every explanation is power leaking out. Every justification is control slipping away. Every defense is proof that you need their approval more than you trust your own judgment. And that need is destroying your emotional control. Because the strong do not explain. The strong decide and execute. Here is what you need to understand. Every time you justify your decisions, defend your choices, or explain your reasoning to people who have no authority over your life, you are leaking emotional power. You are inviting external validation to determine your internal state. You are making their understanding more important than your conviction. And that is weakness. That is giving away control. That is handing power to people who should have none. That is the key. Why over-explanation is emotional leakage. When you explain, you're seeking approval. When you justify, you're requesting permission. When you defend, you are admitting doubt. You are saying my decision is not enough. My choice needs validation. My reasoning needs acceptance. And the moment you say that, you make their opinion more important than your standards. You give them authority over you. You leak power. You have a choice. You can continue explaining yourself to everyone and remain dependent on external validation. Or you can start deciding without justification and reclaim emotional autonomy. But he cannot do both. And right now, your compulsion to explain is making you weak, approval-seeking, and controllable. Think about the last major decision you made. Career change, relationship decision, life direction shift, whatever it was. How many people did you explain it to? How many times did you justify your reasoning? How much energy did you spend trying to make others understand and approve? If you're honest, probably too much. Probably way too much. And all of that explanation was power you gave away to people who should not have it. Here is the problem. You do not owe anyone an explanation for your choices, unless they have actual authority over your life, unless they are directly impacted by your decision, unless their understanding is required for execution. You owe them nothing. Not explanation, not justification, not defense, nothing. Your decision is your decision, and it does not require their comprehension or approval to be valid. But you act like it does. You act like your choices need to be understood by everyone. You act like your decisions need to be approved by the crowd. You act like your life requires consensus. And that is what makes you weak. Because when you need others to understand and approve, you make their comprehension more important than your conviction. You make their validation more significant than your standards. You hand them power over your emotional state. It is not about being rude. It is not about refusing all communication. It is about recognizing when explanation is required and when explanation is just emotional leakage. Explanation is required when someone has authority over the situation. Your boss needs to understand your project approach. Your partner needs to understand your commitment level. Your team needs to understand the strategy. That is necessary explanation. That is communication. But explanation to random acquaintances about your career change, emotional leakage, justification to family members who will never support you anyway, power drain, defense to critics who have no stake in your outcome, weakness. All of that explaining is just seeking validation from people who should not have any say in your decisions. Here is how explanation seeking reveals insecurity. When you need others to understand and approve of your choices, you are admitting you do not trust your own judgment. You're saying, I am not confident in this decision unless others validate it. I'm not secure in this choice unless others agree with it. I need their understanding to feel good about my own reasoning. And that admission is what makes you controllable. Because once you need their validation, they have power. They can withhold approval and control your emotional state. They can refuse to understand and make you doubt yourself. They can criticize your reasoning and make you defensive. They can question your judgment and make you explain endlessly. And all of that happens because you gave them power through your need for explanation. You have a choice. Continue needing others to understand and approve of your choices. Or start trusting your own judgment enough to decide without requiring external validation. One approach makes you dependent on others. The other approach makes you autonomous. Here is the protocol for decision without justification. When you make a choice, you communicate it clearly. This is what I have decided. This is what I am doing. This is the direction I am going. Clear, direct, final. No justification. No explanation unless specifically requested by someone with authority. No defense of your reasoning. Just the decision and the execution. And when people question it, when they ask why, when they challenge your reasoning, you have a standard response. I have made this decision. That is the answer. Not I have made this decision because. Just I have made this decision. Period. Full stop. The decision is made. The choice is final. And their understanding is not required for execution. Most people cannot do this. Most people feel compelled to explain when questioned. Someone asks why, and they immediately justify. Someone challenges, and they immediately defend. Someone expresses confusion, and they immediately explain until understanding is achieved. And all of that explanation is just seeking approval disguised as communication. But you do not need their approval. You do not need their understanding. You do not need their agreement. You need your own conviction. You need your own standards. You need your own trust in your judgment. And if you have that, their questions do not require explanation. Their challenges do not require defense. Their confusion does not require clarification. Your decision stands regardless of their comprehension. That is the key. Operating from this is what I have decided rather than let me explain why I decided this, so you will approve. One statement maintains power. The other statement gives power away. One maintains emotional control. The other creates emotional dependence on external validation. You have a choice right now. There is a decision you have been over-explaining, a choice you have been defending, a direction you have been justifying to people who have no authority over your life. Stop. Stop explaining. Stop justifying. Stop defending. Just decide and execute. And when they question, you say, I have made this decision. Nothing more. Here is what happens when you stop explaining yourself to everyone. You reclaim all the energy you were spending on justification. You eliminate all the emotional dependence on external approval. You establish yourself as someone who operates from internal standards rather than external validation. And you become immune to a primary manipulation tactic. Because people who cannot make you explain cannot make you doubt. People who cannot make you justify cannot make you defensive. People who cannot make you defend cannot control your emotional state through approval or disapproval. And that immunity is power. Power that you currently give away every time you explain when explanation is not required. Power that you leak every time you justify when justification is not necessary. Power that you surrender every time you defend when defense is not warranted. Your emotional control requires that you stop giving this power away. Stop explaining yourself to people who have no authority over your life. Stop seeking approval through justification. Stop defending your decisions to critics who will never be satisfied. Decide, communicate, execute. Nothing more. Most people will be uncomfortable with this. Most people will say you're being closed off, unreasonable, refusing to communicate. Let them say that. Their discomfort with your boundaries is not your problem. Their need for your explanation is not your obligation. Their demand for justification is not your requirement. You do not need their permission to operate this way. You just need your own standards. You learn to separate identity from emotion. You learn to create the gap between stimulus and response. Now you learned to eliminate unnecessary explanation that leaks power. 3 separations, 3 boundaries, 3 protocols that build emotional control by protecting your power from external drains. You stopped explaining. Now, let us talk about the attachment that creates suffering. Chapter 4. detached from outcomes you cannot control. You are suffering because you are attached to outcomes you cannot control. You want the promotion, but you cannot control who gets promoted. You want the relationship to work, but you cannot control another person's choices. You want your business to succeed, but you cannot control market conditions. You want respect, recognition, results, and none of it is within your control. So you suffer, you stress, you lose sleep, you destroy your emotional state worrying about variables you cannot influence. And that attachment is the problem, not the outcomes, the attachment. Here is what you need to understand. The more emotionally invested you are in outcomes you cannot control, the more suffering you experience and the less effective you become. This is not philosophy. This is mechanics. When you attach your emotional state to uncontrollable outcomes, you hand control of your emotions to forces outside yourself. The market controls your mood. Other people's decisions control your peace. Random chance controls your state. And you become a puppet dancing to strings you cannot see and cannot cut. That is the key. The attachment paradox that creates suffering. The more you care about outcomes, the worse you perform in pursuit of those outcomes. The more desperately you need the result, the more your anxiety sabotages your execution. The more emotionally invested you are in the destination, the less capable you become of taking the steps that might get you there. Because attachment hijacks your nervous system. Attachment creates anxiety, and anxiety destroys performance. You have a choice. You can continue attaching your emotional state to outcomes you cannot control and remain in constant suffering. Or you can start detaching from uncontrollables and focus all emotional energy on what you can actually influence. But you cannot do both. And right now, your attachment is destroying both your peace and your performance. Think about something you want desperately, something you have been stressing about, something that keeps you awake at night. Now ask yourself honestly, how much of that outcome is within your control? Can you control whether you get it? Can you guarantee the result? Can you force the outcome? If you are honest, the answer is probably no. You cannot control it. You can influence it. You can work toward it. But you cannot control it. And yet you are suffering as if you could. That is the problem. You are treating uncontrollable outcomes as if they were controllable. You are emotionally investing in variables you cannot influence. You are attaching your peace to results you cannot guarantee. And that attachment creates suffering. Not because the outcomes are bad, because the attachment is misplaced. You're trying to control what cannot be controlled, and that attempt is destroying you. It is not about not caring. It is not about giving up. It is about redirecting your emotional investment from outcomes you cannot control to processes you can. About caring deeply about your effort, your preparation, your execution. About being indifferent to results that depend on factors beyond your influence. About understanding that you control your actions, not their consequences. Here is why outcome detachment improves performance. Athletes know this. Performers know this. High-pressure professionals know this. When you focus on process rather than outcome, you perform better. When you care about execution rather than results, your execution improves. When you detach from the destination and focus on the steps, you arrive faster. Because you're not polluting your performance with anxiety about outcomes you cannot control. The athlete who is desperate to win performs worse than the athlete who is focused on perfect execution. The performer who needs approval from the audience chokes more than the performer who is focused on delivering their craft. The professional who is attached to the promotion makes worse decisions than the professional who is focused on doing excellent work. Same goals, different focus, different results. That is the key. Caring less about results makes you more likely to achieve them. Not because you do not want them, because you're not sabotaging yourself with anxiety about whether you get them. You want the outcome, but you're not attached to it. You're focused on what you control. your preparation, your effort, your execution. And that focus produces better performance than desperation ever could. You have a choice. Continue attaching to outcomes and letting that attachment destroy your performance. Or start detaching from outcomes and redirecting all focus to what you actually control. One approach feels like caring. The other approach produces results. Here is the protocol, the detachment practice that maintains focus. You identify what you can control and what you cannot control. And you redirect all emotional investment from the cannot control column to the can control column. All of it. You drain every ounce of emotional energy from worrying about outcomes and pour it into optimizing process. What can you control? Your effort, your preparation, your decisions, your actions, your response to circumstances, your discipline, your focus, your execution. That is the controllable zone. That is where your emotional investment belongs. That is where your energy should go. What cannot you control? Other people's reactions, market conditions, timing, luck, whether you get selected, whether they say yes, whether the outcome matches your desire. That is the uncontrollable zone. That is where your emotional investment should be zero. That is where indifference should reign. Most people have this backwards. Most people invest emotionally in the uncontrollable and execute carelessly in the controllable. They stress about whether they get the promotion while putting minimal effort into being promotable. They worry about whether the relationship works while refusing to do the work relationships require. They obsess about whether they succeed while avoiding the action success demands. Emotional investment in outcomes. Minimal investment in process. That is backwards. That is why they suffer and fail. You need to reverse this. Maximum emotional investment in process. Zero emotional investment in outcome. Care deeply about what you do. Be indifferent to what happens as a result. Focus all energy on executing perfectly. Detach completely from whether that execution produces the result you want. That is the key. Process focus with outcome indifference. Not because outcomes do not matter, because you cannot control them. An emotional investment in what you cannot control is wasted energy. Energy that should be directed toward what you can control. Your execution. You have a choice right now. There's an outcome you are attached to. Something you desperately want. Something that is creating anxiety because you cannot control whether you get it. And you have been suffering because of that attachment. Identify what you can control in pursuit of that outcome and redirect all emotional energy there. Let go of the outcome. Focus on the process. Detach from the result. Optimize the execution. Here is what happens when you practice detachment. Your anxiety decreases because you're no longer worrying about variables you cannot influence. Your performance improves because you're no longer sabotaging yourself with desperation. Your peace returns because your emotional state is no longer hostage to external outcomes. And paradoxically, you often get the outcomes you were attached to. Not because you wanted them more, because you stopped letting that wanting destroy your ability to pursue them effectively. That is the paradox. Caring less produces more. Detaching improves results. Indifference to outcome enhances performance. Because when you stop polluting your execution with anxiety about results, your execution becomes clean, precise, effective. And effectiveness produces results that desperation never could. Your emotional control requires this detachment, requires that you stop investing emotionally in outcomes you cannot control, requires that you redirect all that energy toward what you can control. Your effort, your execution, your process. That is where control lives. That is where power exists. That is where your emotional investment belongs. Most people will never make this shift. Most people will continue suffering about uncontrollable outcomes while executing carelessly incontrollable processes. They will stress about results while avoiding the work that creates results. They will remain attached to destinations while refusing to take the steps. And they will suffer, and they will fail, and they will never understand that their attachment was the problem. But you're not most people. You understand that attachment to uncontrollable outcomes creates suffering without improving results. You understand that detachment from outcomes allows you to focus on process. You understand that process focus produces better outcomes than outcome obsession ever could. Make the shift. Practice the detachment. Focus on what you control. Let go of what you cannot. You learn to separate identity from emotion. You learn to install the pause between stimulus and response. You learn to stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. Now you learn to detach from outcomes you cannot control. For protocols, for boundaries, for practices that build emotional control by eliminating the leaks, the traps, and the attachments that drain your power. You detached from outcomes. Now let us talk about the weapon most people never learn to use. Chapter 5. Master the art of strategic silence. You think you need to respond to everything. You think silence is weakness. You think not speaking means you have nothing to say. But you are wrong. Silence is not weakness. Silence is power. And your inability to stay silent is destroying your emotional control. Because every unnecessary word is a leak. Every defensive explanation is vulnerability. Every rushed response is power handed to whoever provoked you. And the person who can remain silent longest holds all the leverage. Here is what you need to understand. In conflict, negotiation, and manipulation attempts, the person who can remain silent longest holds the power. This is not opinion. This is mechanics. Silence creates pressure. Silence forces others to reveal information. Silence makes people uncomfortable enough that they fill the void. They make concessions. They expose their position. They show their cards. And while they're talking, you're learning. While they are revealing, you are calculating. While they're giving away leverage, you are collecting it. That is the key. Why silence is more powerful than any response. When someone provokes you and you stay silent, they do not know what you are thinking. They do not know if you're unbothered or planning. They do not know if you dismissed them or cataloged everything for later. That uncertainty creates anxiety in them. And anxiety makes people act, makes them talk more, makes them reveal more, makes them give you exactly the information you need while you give them nothing. You have a choice. You can continue filling every silence with words and giving away leverage. Or you can start using silence as a strategic weapon that collects information and maintains power. But you cannot do both. And right now, your compulsion to talk is making you weak and predictable. Think about the last conflict you had, the last argument, the last tense conversation. How much did you talk? How many words did you use to defend, explain, justify? If you're like most people, too many. Way too many. And every word was information you gave away. Every explanation was leverage you surrendered. Every justification was weakness you displayed. Because you could not stay silent. You had to respond. You had to fill the space. You had to defend yourself. But here's the problem. Every time you talk, you reveal. You reveal your emotional state. You reveal your priorities. You reveal your fears. You reveal your strategy. And people who know how to listen will use every word against you. They will hear what you care about and use it as leverage. They will detect what you fear and use it as a weapon. They will identify what matters to you and use it to control you. And all of that happens because you talked when you should have stayed silent. It is not about never speaking. It is not about refusing all communication. It is about recognizing when speaking serves you and when silence serves you better. Speaking serves you when you need to communicate information, establish boundaries, or direct action. Silence serves you when someone is trying to provoke you, when you need more information before responding, or when the other person revealing more helps your position. Here is how talking too much gives away leverage. Every unnecessary word is a potential vulnerability. You mention something that matters to you. Now they know what to threaten. You express something that frustrates you. Now they know what to trigger. You reveal something you care about. Now they know what to use against you. Oversharing reveals your emotional state, your priorities, your fears, and your strategy. And all of that information is power you hand to people who might use it against you. Most people do not understand this. Most people think communication is always good. They think expressing themselves is healthy. They think sharing their thoughts creates connection. And sometimes that is true, with people who have your interests at heart, with people who operate in good faith, with people who will not weaponize what you reveal. But not everyone operates that way. Some people listen to collect ammunition. Some people ask questions to identify vulnerabilities. Some people encourage you to talk, so you will give them exactly what they need to control you. You have a choice. Continue talking freely with everyone and giving away leverage to people who will use it against you. Or start being selective with your words and using silence to protect your position. One approach feels open and authentic. The other approach keeps you safe and powerful. Here is the protocol. Practicing strategic silence in high-pressure situations. You identify situations where silence serves you better than speech. And in those situations, you stay silent. Deliberately, intentionally, strategically. Not because you have nothing to say. Because saying nothing serves your interest better than saying something. Conflict situation. Someone provokes you. They insult you. They challenge you. They try to trigger an emotional reaction. Your impulse is to respond, to defend, to fire back. Do not. Stay silent. Let the provocation hang in the air. Let them feel uncomfortable about what they just said. Let them wonder why you're not reacting. That silence creates more pressure on them than any response you could give. And often, they will backpedal. They will soften. They will reveal that the provocation was a test, and you passed by staying silent. Negotiation situation. You make an offer. They respond with silence. Most people panic. They fill the silence by explaining their reasoning, justifying their number, or immediately making a better offer. Do not match their silence. Let the silence extend. Let whoever breaks first lose leverage. Because the person who speaks first after the offer reveals more about their position than they should. And you want them to speak first. So you stay silent, uncomfortably silent, until they break. Criticism situation. Someone criticizes you, your work, your decisions, your approach. Your impulse is to defend, to explain why you did what you did, to justify your reasoning. Do not. Stay silent. Let the criticism land. Let them finish completely. And often, in that silence, they will continue talking. They will reveal the real issue beneath the criticism. They will expose their actual concern. They will give you information you would never get if you interrupted with defense. So you stay silent. You listen. You collect information. And only then do you respond. If you respond at all, that is the key. Strategic silence is not about never speaking. Strategic silence is about speaking only when speaking serves your interests better than silence. And in high-pressure situations, silence usually serves you better. Because silence protects information, creates pressure, and forces others to reveal while you remain concealed. You have a choice right now. There's a situation where you have been talking too much, explaining too much, defending too much, justifying too much. And all of that talking is giving away leverage. Stop talking. Start staying silent. Let the silence create pressure. Let others fill the void. Let them reveal while you collect. Here is what happens when you master strategic silence. You become unreadable. People cannot tell what you are thinking. They cannot predict your response. They cannot trigger you because you do not react. And that uncertainty gives you enormous power. Because predictable people are controllable. Unreadable people are not. And silence is what makes you unreadable. You also collect more information than people who talk constantly. Because while you are silent, you are listening. Actually listening. Not waiting to speak. Not preparing your response. Listening to understand their position, their fears, their priorities. And that information becomes leverage you can use when you finally do speak. If you speak at all, your emotional control depends on your ability to stay silent when provoked, to remain quiet when pressured, to resist the urge to fill every silence with words. That silence is not emptiness. That silence is power. That silence is control. That silence is you maintaining leverage while others give theirs away. Most people will never master this. Most people are too uncomfortable with silence. They will fill every gap. They will respond to every provocation. They will explain when explanation serves no one but their need to be understood. And they will give away power with every unnecessary word. And they will wonder why they always feel like they're losing in conflicts and negotiations. It is because they talk too much and stay silent too little. But you are not most people. You understand that silence is a weapon. You understand that every word should be strategic. You understand that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Practice the silence. Master the pause. Learn to be comfortable in the void that makes others uncomfortable. That is where power lives. You learn to separate identity from emotion. You learn to pause between stimulus and response. You learn to stop explaining unnecessarily. You learn to detach from uncontrollable outcomes. Now you learn to wield strategic silence. 5 protocols that build emotional control by eliminating reactions, protecting information, and maintaining power. You mastered silence. Now let us talk about the identity trap that makes you fragile. Chapter 6. Kill your ego before it kills you. You think your ego is confidence. You think the need to be right, to be recognized, to be validated is strength. But you are wrong. That is not confidence. That is ego. And ego is the most fragile thing you possess. Ego makes you defensive when criticized. Ego makes you reactive when challenged. Ego makes you emotionally volatile when your value is questioned. And that volatility is destroying your control. Because ego is not strength. Ego is weakness pretending to be confidence. Here is what you need to understand. Ego masquerades as confidence. Most people confuse the two. They think ego is healthy self-regard. They think ego is standing up for yourself. They think ego is knowing your worth. But ego is none of those things. Ego is the fragile identity that requires constant validation and reacts defensively to any perceived threat. Ego is the part of you that needs to be right, needs to be recognized, needs to be superior, needs external confirmation that you matter. That is the key. Ego is identity built on external validation. And external validation is always fragile, always vulnerable, always dependent on forces you cannot control. When your sense of self requires other people to acknowledge your value, you hand them control over your emotional state. When your worth depends on being right, anyone who proves you wrong threatens your identity. When your confidence requires recognition, anyone who overlooks you damages your sense of self. That is ego. That is fragility disguised as strength. You have a choice. You can continue letting ego control your responses and remain emotionally fragile. Or you can kill your ego and build identity on internal standards that cannot be threatened by external events. But you cannot do both. And right now, your ego is making you weak, defensive, and easily manipulated. Think about the last time someone criticized you. Really criticized you. Not gently, harshly. How did you respond? If you're honest, you probably defended. You probably explained why they were wrong. You probably felt the need to prove your value. You probably reacted emotionally because the criticism felt like an attack on who you are. That is ego. That is your fragile identity feeling threatened. That is weakness. Here is the problem. Every time ego controls your response, you sacrifice long-term success for short-term emotional satisfaction. Someone criticizes your work, and ego makes you defensive instead of curious about whether the criticism has merit. Someone challenges your idea, and ego makes you argue instead of evaluate whether they might be right. Someone overlooks your contribution, and ego makes you resentful instead of focused on doing better work. Ego-driven reactions feel good in the moment. They feel like standing up for yourself, but they destroy relationships, opportunities, and growth. It is not about accepting all criticism. It is not about letting people disrespect you. It is about separating legitimate feedback from ego threats. About recognizing when criticism contains value versus when it is just noise. About responding strategically instead of reacting emotionally because your ego feels attacked. And you cannot make those distinctions when ego controls you, because ego treats all criticism as threat, all challenge as attack, all disagreement as disrespect. Here is why ego-driven reactions destroy relationships and opportunities. When ego controls you, you prioritize being right over being effective. You argue when you should listen. You defend when you should learn. You prove your worth when you should demonstrate your value through action. And all of that ego-driven behavior pushes people away, makes you difficult to work with, makes you someone who cannot be coached, makes you someone who values their identity over truth, and that destroys opportunities that require collaboration, feedback, and growth. Most people will never recognize this. Most people will defend their ego forever. They will call it self-respect. They will call it boundaries. They will call it confidence. But it is not any of those things. It is fragility. It is weakness. It is emotional volatility created by building identity on external validation that can be threatened by anyone at any time. You have a choice. Continue letting ego control your responses and remain fragile, or kill your ego and become emotionally bulletproof. One approach feels like strength. The other approach is strength. Here is the protocol: separating identity from achievement to kill ego. You build self-worth that is independent of external validation, performance, or comparison. When your value is not dependent on being right, being recognized, or being superior, criticism and setbacks no longer trigger emotional reactions because they no longer threaten who you are. Start with this recognition. You are not your achievements. You are not your performance. You are not your recognition. You are not your status. Those are things you have done or things others have acknowledged. But they are not who you are. When you identify as your achievements, any threat to those achievements threatens your identity. When you identify as your status, any loss of status destroys your sense of self. That identification is ego, and that identification is what makes you fragile. So you separate. You recognize that you are the person who works, not the work itself. You are the person who performs, not the performance. You're the person who pursues goals, not the achievement of those goals. And when you make that separation, external events lose their power to threaten your identity. Bad performance does not mean you are bad. Criticism does not mean you are inadequate. Failure does not mean you are a failure. Those are just events, just outcomes, just feedback, not statements about your worth. That is the key. When your value is not dependent on external validation, you become immune to ego threats. Someone criticizes you, and you evaluate whether the criticism has merit without feeling personally attacked. Someone challenges you, and you consider whether they might be right without feeling threatened. Someone overlooks you, and you continue doing good work without needing recognition to feel valuable. That is what killing ego creates. Emotional immunity to the triggers that control most people. You have a choice right now. There's an area where your ego is making you fragile, where criticism triggers defense, where challenge triggers argument, where lack of recognition triggers resentment. Identify it and separate your identity from that area. You're not your performance in that area. You're the person working in that area. And that separation makes you unbreakable in ways ego-driven people will never be. Here is what happens when you kill your ego. You stop being defensive. Criticism becomes information instead of attack. You start being curious. Challenge becomes opportunity to learn instead of threat to defend against. You remain focused. Lack of recognition becomes irrelevant because your value is not dependent on others noticing. And all of that creates massive strategic advantage over people still controlled by ego. Because ego-driven people are predictable. Criticize them and they defend. Challenge them and they argue. Overlook them and they resent. You can control ego-driven people by triggering their ego. But you cannot control someone with no ego. Someone whose identity is not threatened by criticism, challenge, or being overlooked. Someone who evaluates everything strategically instead of reacting emotionally to protect fragile identity. That person is dangerous. That person is you after you kill your ego. Your emotional control requires killing your ego, requires building identity that is not dependent on external validation, requires separating who you are from what you achieve, what you perform, what others recognize. That separation is what makes you immune to the ego triggers that control most people. Make this separation. Kill the ego. Build unbreakable identity. You learn to separate identity from emotion. You learn to pause before responding. You learn to stop explaining unnecessarily. You learn to detach from outcomes. You learn to wield strategic silence. Now you learn to kill your ego. 6 protocols building toward complete emotional control. You killed your ego. Now let us talk about what difficult situations actually reveal. Chapter 7. Pressure reveals, it does not create. You think pressure creates problems. You think stress causes weakness. You think difficult situations make you lose control. But you are wrong. Pressure does not create anything. Pressure reveals what already exists. Stress does not cause weakness. Stress exposes weakness that was always there. Difficult situations do not make you lose control. Difficult situations show you that you never had control in the first place. And that revelation is valuable. Because you cannot fix what you cannot see. And pressure shows you everything. Here is what you need to understand. Pressure does not create character flaws, emotional weakness, or lack of control. Pressure reveals them. When everything is easy, when life is comfortable, when circumstances are favorable, everyone looks controlled. Everyone appears strong. Everyone seems like they have their emotions managed. But that appearance is not reality. That appearance is just the absence of testing. And the moment pressure arrives, the moment stress increases, the moment circumstances become difficult, the truth reveals itself. That is the key. Stress exposes what already exists. The person who loses their temper under pressure was always someone with anger management issues. The person who panics under stress was always someone with fragile emotional control. The person who collapses under difficulty was always someone who lacked resilience. Pressure did not create those problems. Pressure just made them visible. And that visibility is not the problem. That visibility is the opportunity. Because now you know what needs to be fixed. You have a choice. You can continue viewing pressure as the enemy that creates problems. Or you can start viewing pressure as the diagnostic tool that reveals problems. But you cannot do both. And right now, your avoidance of pressure is preventing you from seeing the weaknesses you need to address. Think about the last time you were under real pressure, real stress, real difficulty. How did you respond? If you lost control, if you reacted emotionally, if you collapsed under the weight, that was not pressure creating weakness. That was pressure revealing weakness that existed before the pressure arrived. The weakness was always there. Comfortable circumstances just allowed you to pretend it was not. Here is the problem. Most people blame pressure for their loss of control. They say the situation made them angry. The stress made them anxious. The difficulty made them collapse. But situations do not make you anything. Situations reveal what you already are. The anger was already there. The anxiety was already there. The fragility was already there. Pressure just exposed it. And blaming pressure for what pressure reveals is how you stay weak. Because if pressure creates the problem, you cannot fix the problem. You can only avoid pressure. But if pressure reveals the problem, you can fix the problem. You can build the capacity that pressure exposed you lack. It is not about enjoying pressure. It is not about seeking stress for stress' sake. It is about recognizing that pressure is diagnostic. Pressure shows you exactly where you need to build emotional capacity, where your control breaks down, where your resilience is insufficient, where your emotional management fails. That information is valuable. That information tells you exactly what to work on, but only if you stop blaming pressure for revealing it and start using the revelation to build capacity. Here is why avoiding pressure guarantees emotional fragility. People who organize their lives around avoiding stress, conflict, and difficulty never develop emotional resilience. They never build the capacity to handle pressure because they never expose themselves to pressure. They stay comfortable. They stay safe. They stay in environments where their weaknesses never get tested. And they think that means they are strong. But it does not mean they are strong. It means they are untested. And untested always fails when testing becomes unavoidable. Life will eventually present pressure you cannot avoid. Stress you cannot escape. Difficulty you cannot sidestep. And when that unavoidable pressure arrives, people who spent their lives avoiding pressure collapse because they have no capacity. They have no resilience. They have no emotional control under stress. Not because pressure created weakness, because they never built strength. And pressure revealed the absence. You have a choice. Continue avoiding pressure and remain fragile. Or start using pressure as training and build resilience. One approach feels safer. The other approach creates actual safety through capacity. Here is the protocol. Using pressure as training to build emotional immunity. You systematically expose yourself to controllable pressure, not uncontrollable chaos, not overwhelming stress. Controllable pressure that is intense enough to test you, but manageable enough that you can learn from it. And through that systematic exposure, you train your nervous system to remain calm under stress. You build the emotional capacity that pressure will eventually demand. Cold exposure, deliberate cold showers, or ice baths create physiological stress that you practice remaining calm through. Your body wants to panic. Your breath wants to race. Your mind wants to escape. But you stay. You breathe. You remain controlled. And through that practice, you teach your nervous system that discomfort is not emergency. That stress is not threat. That you can remain calm even when your body is screaming at you to react. That training transfers to every other pressure situation. Fasting. Deliberate periods without food create psychological stress. Your body wants to eat. Your mind generates urgency. Your emotions become volatile. But you do not eat. You stay with the discomfort. You remain controlled despite the pressure. And through that practice, you learn that impulses do not have to be obeyed. That discomfort can be tolerated. That you control your actions even when your body is demanding otherwise. Difficult conversations. Deliberately having conversations that make you uncomfortable. Conversations where conflict might arise. Conversations where you might be criticized. Conversations where tension is present. These create social pressure. Your ego wants to defend. Your emotions want to react. Your nervous system wants to avoid. But you stay. You listen. You respond strategically instead of reacting emotionally. And through that practice, you build the capacity to remain controlled when social pressure is high. High-stakes situations. Deliberately putting yourself in situations where performance matters, where outcomes have consequences, where pressure is real. Not recklessly, not stupidly, but deliberately seeking situations that test you. Because testing reveals weaknesses, and revealing weaknesses allows you to build strength. Every high-pressure situation you survive with control is training that makes the next high-pressure situation easier. That is the key. Systematic exposure to controllable pressure builds capacity, builds resilience, builds the emotional immunity that allows you to remain calm when everyone else is losing control. But most people never do this. Most people avoid all pressure until unavoidable pressure arrives. And then they collapse. And then they blame the pressure. And then they learn nothing. You have a choice right now. There is pressure you have been avoiding. Stress you have been escaping. Difficulty you have been sidestepping. And that avoidance is keeping you fragile. Stop avoiding. Start exposing. Use the pressure as training. Let it reveal your weaknesses, and then build the capacity those weaknesses demand. Here is what happens when you stop avoiding pressure and start using it as training. You discover you are capable of far more than you thought. The situations that used to overwhelm you become manageable. The stress that used to break you becomes tolerable. The pressure that used to make you lose control becomes the environment where you operate best. Not because the pressure decreased, because your capacity increased, because you trained in pressure until pressure no longer controls you. And that capacity is what separates those who thrive under pressure from those who collapse. Same pressure, different capacity, different training, different results. The person who collapses avoided pressure their entire life. The person who thrives trained in pressure deliberately. Both faced the same test. Only one was prepared. Only one had capacity. Only one remained controlled. Your emotional control under pressure depends on your willingness to train under pressure, to expose yourself to stress deliberately, to use difficult situations as diagnostic tools that reveal weaknesses, and then to build the capacity those weaknesses demand. That is not optional. That is the mechanism. Avoid pressure, stay fragile. Train in pressure, become strong. You learn to separate identity from emotion. You learn to pause before responding. You learn to stop explaining. You learn to detach from outcomes. You learn to use strategic silence. You learn to kill your ego. Now you learn to use pressure as training. 7 protocols building unbreakable emotional control. You use pressure as training. Now let us talk about the invisible force that hijacks your state. Chapter 8. Emotional contagion is real. Protect your state. You think your emotional state is yours. You think what you feel is determined by what happens to you, what you think about, what you decide to focus on. But you are wrong. Your emotional state is constantly being infected by the people around you. Their anger becomes your irritation. Their anxiety becomes your stress. Their panic becomes your fear. And you do not even notice it happening. Because emotional contagion is invisible. It operates below conscious awareness. And it is destroying your control. Here is what you need to understand. Mirror neurons and limbic resonance mean that other people's emotional states directly affect yours. This is not metaphor. This is neuroscience. When you're near someone who is angry, your mirror neurons activate the same patterns associated with anger in your own brain. When someone around you is anxious, your limbic system begins resonating with their anxiety. Emotional states transfer from person to person like viruses, and most people lack the immunity to prevent infection. That is the key. Emotional contagion makes you controllable by anyone who can manipulate the emotional environment. Someone walks into the room radiating anger, and suddenly you feel tense. Someone expresses anxiety, and suddenly you feel worried. Someone broadcasts chaos, and suddenly you feel unstable. You think those feelings are yours. You think they arose from you, but they did not. They were transferred to you. And that transfer is happening constantly without your awareness or consent. You have a choice. You can continue being infected by every emotional state you encounter and remain controlled by environmental chaos. Or you can build emotional immunity that protects your state regardless of what others are broadcasting. But you cannot do both. And right now, your lack of immunity is making you controllable by anyone who can manipulate the emotional atmosphere. Think about the last time you were around someone who was intensely emotional. Maybe they were angry about something. Maybe they were anxious about a situation. Maybe they were panicking about a problem. How did you feel after being around them? If you are honest, you probably felt some version of what they were feeling. Not because anything happened to you. Not because you had reason to feel that way. Because their emotional state infected yours. Because emotional contagion transferred their state to you without your permission. Here is the problem. You cannot control yourself if you are constantly being infected by others. You cannot maintain calm if you are surrounded by chaos. You cannot stay focused if everyone around you is scattered. You cannot remain strategic if the environment is pushing emotional reactions. And most people never realize this is happening. They think their emotional volatility is their own. They think their inability to stay controlled is their weakness. But often, it is just infection, just emotional contagion that they never learned to protect against. It is not about becoming cold. It is not about refusing all connection. It is about recognizing that connection has a cost. That empathy creates vulnerability. That being open to others' emotions means being vulnerable to infection from those emotions. And that vulnerability needs to be managed, protected, controlled, or it will control you. Here is why empaths and highly sensitive people are most vulnerable. The same qualities that create compassion and connection also create vulnerability to emotional manipulation and environmental chaos. Empaths feel what others feel. That is their gift. But that is also their weakness. Because feeling what others feel means being infected by what others feel. And if others feel anger, anxiety, panic, or chaos, the empath feels it too. Not by choice, by nature, by the very sensitivity that makes them compassionate. And manipulators know this. Toxic people know this. Emotional vampires know this. They know that sensitive people will absorb their emotional state. They know that empaths cannot help but feel what they feel. And they use that vulnerability deliberately. They broadcast negativity knowing it will infect. They create chaos knowing it will destabilize. They express extreme emotions knowing sensitive people will absorb them. And the empath, the sensitive person, the compassionate one, gets destroyed. Not because they are weak, because they lack boundaries, because they never learned to protect their state. You have a choice. Continue being emotionally porous and absorbing every state you encounter. Or start building emotional boundaries that allow connection without contamination. One approach makes you compassionate but unstable. The other approach makes you compassionate and controlled. Here is the protocol: building emotional immunity through state management. You learn to maintain your emotional state regardless of environmental chaos. Not by ignoring others, not by becoming disconnected, by protecting your state while remaining present, by creating boundaries that prevent infection while allowing connection, by managing your own emotional atmosphere so powerfully that you influence the environment instead of being influenced by it. First, awareness. You notice when your emotional state shifts in response to others. Someone walks in angry and you feel tension arise. Notice that. Someone expresses anxiety and you feel worry appear. Notice that. Someone broadcasts chaos and you feel instability. Notice that. Awareness is the first line of defense. You cannot protect against what you do not notice. So you notice. You catch the moment when your state begins shifting in response to external emotional broadcasts. Second, breathing. When you notice infection beginning, you return to breath. Deliberate, controlled breathing that anchors you in your own nervous system instead of resonating with theirs. Their anger is there. Your breath is here. Their anxiety is there. Your breath is here. Their chaos is there. Your breath is here. The breath creates physical separation that prevents emotional merger. The breath keeps you in your body, in your state, instead of drifting into theirs. Third, physical anchoring. You use physical sensations to ground yourself in your own experience. Feel your feet on the ground. Notice the weight of your body in the chair. Sense the temperature of the air. These physical anchors keep you present in your own experience instead of absorbed in theirs. They create sensory boundaries that prevent emotional bleeding from their state into yours. Fourth, mental framing. You remind yourself that their emotional state is theirs, not yours. They are angry. You are not angry. They are anxious. You are not anxious. They are chaotic. You are not chaotic. You maintain clear distinction between their experience and your experience, between their state and your state, between their emotions and your emotions. That distinction is the boundary that prevents infection. Fifth, state assertion. You actively maintain your chosen emotional state regardless of their broadcasts. They are broadcasting anger. You maintain calm. They're broadcasting anxiety. You maintain peace. They're broadcasting chaos. You maintain stability. You do not just resist their state. You actively assert your own. And when your state is strong enough, when your assertion is powerful enough, you influence them instead of being influenced by them. That is the key. Strong states influence weak states. If your emotional control is stronger than their emotional chaos, you stabilize them instead of being destabilized by them. If your calm is more powerful than their anger, they calm down instead of making you angry. But if your state is weak, if your boundaries are porous, if your control is fragile, their state will overwrite yours every time. You have a choice right now. There are people in your life who destabilize your emotional state, whose anger infects you, whose anxiety spreads to you, whose chaos contaminates you. And you have been allowing that infection because you did not know it was happening or did not know how to prevent it. Now you know. Now you have the protocol. Implement it. Protect your state. Build immunity. Here is what happens when you build emotional immunity. You stop being controlled by environmental chaos. You could be in a room full of angry people and remain calm. You could be surrounded by anxiety and remain peaceful. You can be in the middle of chaos and remain stable. Not because you're disconnected, because you are protected, because your state is yours and you defend it against infection. And that immunity gives you massive power. Because while everyone else is being swept up in emotional contagion, you remain controlled. While everyone else is reacting to the emotional environment, you remain strategic. While everyone else is infected by the prevailing emotional state, you maintain your chosen state. And that makes you the most powerful person in any emotional environment. Not the loudest, not the most reactive, the most controlled. Your emotional control requires this immunity, requires that you protect your state from infection, requires that you build boundaries that allow connection without contamination, requires that you become strong enough in your own state that you influence environments instead of being influenced by them. Build the immunity. Practice the protocol. Protect your state. You learned 7 protocols. Now you learn the 8th. Emotional immunity that prevents contagion. You protected your state. Now let us talk about the timing that determines whether decisions succeed or fail. Chapter 10. Cold is not cruel, it is clear. You think emotional control means becoming emotionless. You think staying cold means you stop feeling. You think the person who remains calm under pressure has no feelings at all. But you are wrong. Cold is not the absence of emotion. Cold is the presence of control. Cold is not cruel. Cold is clear. And that clarity is what separates those who lead from those who follow, those who win from those who lose, those who shape reality from those who are shaped by it. Here is what you need to understand. Staying cold under pressure does not mean you lack feelings. It means you do not let feelings control your actions. The emotion is there. You feel it. You experience it fully. But you do not become it. You do not react from it. You do not let it dictate your decisions. You observe it. You evaluate it. You use it as information. And then you respond strategically regardless of what you feel. That is the key. Emotional control is not emotional suppression. Suppression is pushing feelings down, pretending they do not exist, refusing to acknowledge what you feel. That is not control. That is denial. And denial always fails because suppressed emotions eventually explode. They build pressure until they break through in destructive ways. That is not what we are building. We are not building suppression. We are building integration. The ability to feel everything, react to nothing, and respond to everything strategically. You have a choice. You can continue confusing emotional control with emotional absence and stay trapped in the false belief that control means becoming a robot. Or you can understand that control means feeling fully while choosing carefully. But you cannot do both. And right now, your confusion is probably preventing you from developing real control because you think control requires killing your emotions. Think about the most emotionally controlled person you know. Really controlled, not suppressed, not fake, actually controlled. Do they lack emotions? If you're honest, probably not. They probably feel deeply. They probably experience the full range of human emotion. But they do not let those emotions control them. They feel anger, but do not act from rage. They feel fear, but do not act from panic. They feel sadness, but do not act from despair. They feel everything. They just do not become everything they feel. That is what we are building. That integration. That capacity to experience the full spectrum of emotion while maintaining complete control over your responses. Not because you are cold, because you are clear. Clear about what you feel. Clear about what serves your interests. Clear about what action is strategically optimal. And that clarity only comes when you can separate feeling from action. When you can observe emotion without being controlled by it. Here is why clarity requires emotional distance. You cannot see reality clearly while drowning in emotional reaction. When anger controls you, you cannot assess the situation objectively. When fear controls you, you cannot evaluate options rationally. When euphoria controls you, you cannot see risks accurately. Emotional immersion distorts perception, and distorted perception produces terrible decisions. So you need distance, not to stop feeling, to see clearly despite feeling. That distance is what cold provides. Cold is the space between the emotion and your response. Cold is the gap where you observe what you feel without being swept away by it. Cold is the clarity that allows you to feel anger without punching walls. to feel fear without running away, to feel sadness without giving up, to feel euphoria without making stupid commitments. Cold is not the absence of feeling. Cold is the presence of choice despite feeling. And that choice is what makes you powerful. Because most people are controlled by their emotions. Most people feel anger and react from anger. Most people feel fear and act from fear. Most people are passengers to whatever emotion is strongest in the moment. But you're different. You feel the emotion. You acknowledge the emotion. And then you choose your response based on strategy instead of feeling. That is cold. That is clear. That is control. You have a choice right now. Continue believing that emotional control means emotional absence. Or start understanding that emotional control means emotional integration. One belief keeps you confused and stuck. The other belief opens the path to actual mastery. Here is the integration protocol. The final transformation is not eliminating emotion, but integrating it. Using emotional information as data while maintaining control of your responses. Emotions tell you things. Anger tells you a boundary was violated. Fear tells you risk is present. Sadness tells you loss occurred. Euphoria tells you reward is near. These are valuable signals. You do not ignore them. You use them, but you do not obey them. You integrate them. When anger arises, you notice it. You acknowledge it. You ask, what is this anger telling me? What boundary was crossed? What injustice occurred? You extract the information, and then you decide how to respond. Maybe the anger is valid and action is required. But the action is not rage-driven destruction. The action is strategic correction. Maybe the anger is invalid and no action is required. Either way, you decide based on strategy, not based on the intensity of the anger. When fear arises, you notice it. You acknowledge it. You ask, what is this fear telling me? What risk is present? What danger exists? You extract the information, and then you decide how to respond. Maybe the fear is valid and caution is warranted. But the response is not panic-driven avoidance. The response is strategic risk management. Maybe the fear is invalid and no caution is needed. Either way, you decide based on assessment, not based on the strength of the fear. That is integration. That is using emotion as data. That is feeling everything, reacting to nothing, and responding to everything strategically. And that is what cold actually means. Not emotionless. Emotion-informed, but not emotion-controlled. Clear despite feeling. Strategic regardless of intensity. Your emotional control culminates here. In this understanding. In this integration. In this recognition that cold is not cruel, it is clear. You feel deeply. You observe accurately. You respond strategically. That is mastery. That is control. That is what makes you dangerous in the best possible way. You learn 9 protocols. Separation of identity from emotion. Pause between stimulus and response. Elimination of unnecessary explanation. Detachment from uncontrollable outcomes. Strategic use of silence. Death of ego. Pressure as training. State protection from contagion. Decision delay until emotional baseline. And now the 10th. Integration of emotion and control. Feeling everything. Reacting to nothing. Responding strategically to everything. These 10 protocols build complete emotional control. Not through suppression. Through integration. Not through coldness that lacks feeling. Through coldness that maintains clarity despite feeling. This is the art of staying cold under pressure. This is what makes you immune to chaos, manipulation, and emotional traps. This is what separates you from those who are controlled by every feeling that passes through their nervous system. Your transformation is complete when these protocols become automatic. When you no longer have to consciously remember to pause, to protect your state, to delay decisions, to observe emotions without becoming them. When the integration is so deep that you cannot not operate this way. When cold clarity is your default state regardless of what you feel or what pressure arrives. That is mastery. That is control. That is the art you came here to learn. You have the framework. You have the protocols. You have the understanding. Now you have the practice. Every day, every situation, every emotion, every pressure, every trigger, every manipulation attempt, every chaos. You practice. You implement. You refine until the art becomes nature. Until cold is how you operate. Until emotional control is not something you do. It is who you are. You're no longer controlled by your emotions. You are the observer of your emotions. You no longer react to triggers. You respond strategically. You no longer explain unnecessarily. You decide and execute. You no longer attach to uncontrollable outcomes. You focus on controllable process. You no longer talk when silence serves you better. You wield strategic silence. You no longer let ego control you. You killed the identity trap. You no longer avoid pressure. You use it as training. You no longer absorb emotional contagion. You protect your state. You no longer decide at emotional extremes. You wait for baseline. And you no longer confuse cold with cruel. You understand cold is clear. That is emotional control. That is the art. That is what makes you immune to the forces that control everyone else. Now go practice it. Now go live it. Now go prove it. Now you understand what separates those who control their emotions from those who are controlled by them. It's not intelligence. It's not resources. It's not luck. It's emotional control. The ability to stay cool when everyone else is losing their minds. The ability to respond when everyone else is reacting. The ability to observe emotions without becoming them. The ability to remain balanced, regardless of the chaos. Each chapter has given you a piece of the framework. Separate identity from emotion. Install the pause between trigger and response. Eliminate unnecessary explanations. Detach from uncontrollable outcomes. Embrace strategic silence. Kill the ego. Use pressure as training. Protect your state from contagion. Postpone decisions until emotional neutrality returns. Understand that coolness is clarity, not cruelty. This is not theory. It is mental restructuring. Tomorrow, you'll be triggered. Someone will try to provoke you. Something will pressure you. Chaos will come again. And you have a choice. React emotionally and hand over control to whatever triggered you. Or stay cool, observe what is happening, and respond strategically. One choice makes you controllable. The other choice makes you dangerous. The strong stay cool. The weak stay hot. Now prove which one you are.